Good afternoon. I'd like to call to order Environmental Matters Committee for Wednesday, November 20th. For the record, all the members are in attendance. Let's see. Anybody entertain a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. And how about minutes?
Move recommendation, approve the minutes for
Both of them?
both.
Okay.
Both meeting minutes. Aye. Second.
All those in favor of approving the minutes, say aye.
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 Aye. All right. Legislation.
026-19.
So we'll have legislation followed by updates from Office of Environmental Policy. So starting with 02719. I'd like to invite Planning and Zoning to come up and give us any kind of introduction, background you may want to give on the legislation.
Did you approve both sets of minutes?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to go over there later.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Sally Nash, Department of Planning and Zoning. To my left is Cynthia Gudinius, Planning and Zoning. To my right is Jackie Gild, Office of Environmental Policy. And to her right is Tom Smith, Planning and Zoning. Today we are here to talk about Ordinance 02719, Critical Area Overlay, which has gone before the Planning Commission, and they recommended adoption of the ordinance. It is, for the most part, been adopted in order to bring our existing code in line with the state's model ordinance. So there aren't any substantive changes. There's sections that have been rearranged and put in their own section or combined with another section, things of this nature. There's things that have been further defined that weren't defined in the past. And there's practices that we used in our department relying on state code that are now codified in our local program. So we think that will be a positive because everything will be in one place and people will be able to find how to go about development in the critical area. So if you have any questions about which sections have been moved to where, I will refer you to the spreadsheet, which has been attached to the ordinance. It shows each existing section and each proposed section, and there's notes in the middle that explain how they relate to each other. This ordinance is not just a text amendment, it's also a map amendment, and that is a requirement of the state, actually. They are going through the whole state, updating their critical area maps based on new technology. That's a good update from considering the original maps were based on the wetland maps from, 1976? The 1976 wetland maps. So there have been some changes to our shoreline since 1976, and as a result, you can see in the maps that some people are gaining critical area on their property and some people are losing critical area on their property. There was a public meeting in last May that the Critical Area Commission hosted, and they sent letters to all property owners who now will have more than 1% of critical area than they had before on their property. And so that gave them a chance to come in and ask questions about their property and how we were going to be treating them. We have included some grandfathering language for these properties, so they're not suddenly considered to be non-conforming. Other than that, though, our code maintains our strict standards. We're stricter than the state in several places, including our lot coverage requirements in IDA. That is maintained, as well as our tree canopy replacement requirements. So Are there any questions? Yes.
Yeah, so any questions on the underlying ordinance itself, Alderman Cheney?
Does the state review our mapping and approve our mapping? I mean, what's the procedure with that?
So the states actually produced the maps. We worked with them to field verify certain locations that they couldn't tell exactly what was going on there. They produced the maps, they printed the maps. After the city council adopts the text amendment and the maps, that our local program will go to the Critical Area Commission for their approval.
Thank you.
Alderman Rennet?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, thank you for the spreadsheet, and that made it so much easier. I have to warn you, no good deed goes unpunished, so I do have 12 questions on the spreadsheet, but they're mild, and they're much out of curiosity. And then I presume, Mr. Chair, we'll get into the amendments. So using your spreadsheet on, and this is really a question for the committee, on page 12, where we talk about the percent of lot coverage, I presume this is a time, if we want to make lot coverage more restrictive, that the committee should be thinking about its policy on lot coverage. So right now, residential lot coverage is 50%, and then we go on up to industrial lot coverage can go up to 95%. I assume that there is a long history of thought and science behind these different coverage amounts. I also assume that the coverage amounts have some impact on TMDLs and other things. So I wanted to sort of bring up a general question about lot coverage with the experts and with the committee. I don't know if, Jackie, you have any thoughts?
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Jackie could probably also speak to this, the TMDL part, but for us, this chart here is stricter than anything the state requires. The state does not require any lot coverage restrictions in IDA. So we felt like this is a pretty good level of percentage to maintain. If we increase it now, we will generate thousands of non-conforming properties throughout the city.
Hey.
And we were reluctant to do that.
Yeah,
we discussed it with the Critical Area Commission. We worked very closely with them throughout drafting this ordinance. What would the advantage be of increasing the percentage of lot coverage that was required? What would be the advantage of increasing it 5%, 10%, 20%? The science isn't really there to be able to tell us clearly what the benefit of that kind of increase would be. There are other practices that can help treat quantity and quality of water, which is what this is trying to do, that are more effective than increasing this number and rendering a whole host of administrative nightmares come true.
The thing that drew my attention to it was, and this is a notion, not anything that I know for a fact, but the industrial can be 95%, and it would seem to me like that would be the place where I'd be most worried about bad things coming off of the property. So having that higher coverage was really a question or
So
a
we
worry.
don't actually even have any restrictions now in the industrial district for IDA. So it is basically essentially going from 100% to 95% with this zoning text amendment. If you look at existing conditions, though, I would say most of our industrial areas are probably pretty close to 100. So we might have the problem with creating nonconformities just with this 95, but we felt like that was a good trade-off in this case, since we don't even have any restrictions on those properties, and there aren't that many properties in the industrial district that are in the critical area either.
So in lieu of lot coverage, do the stormwater management rules require buffers or things so that we don't get all kinds of nasty runoff from something that's.
Those will
100%.
always apply if a grading permit is required.
All right. I would suggest to the committee, though, that this is something that we might want to put on our parking lot for future. I really don't even know where all the industrial areas are. I don't have the sense that we have a lot of heavy industry, but at 100% coverage, doesn't feel like there's a lot of buffering space for me. So that's what actually said, maybe we should look at all the rest of these too and see if they need to have changes. But
And I did
We
talk
also,
to staff about that, but yeah, I decided to back off.
Alderman
because of the-
Savage did bring that point up. We discussed it with the Critical Area Commission and the Environmental Commission. And I think, it was kind of the feeling that there's not quite enough evidence to show that that would benefit. But there is, in the IDA, whenever you do increase your lot coverage, you do have to do mitigation, typically through planting trees and shrubs. So that does, in essence, improve water quality in that case. And that is a pretty rigorous requirement that we have.
Okay.
And did you want to hear more about the TMDLs and the impervious
of course,
surface?
always.
To your question whether critical area law is involved with TMDL, the answer is no. As of right now, EPA is strongly considering forest preservation and tree canopy goals as credits towards TMDL objectives and implementation of WIP plans. But right now, the answer is no, critical area doesn't apply. Those could be shoreline stabilization techniques, could be things coming down the pike that will gain TMDL credit. We do have, the Maryland has, as you're probably aware, the Maryland Living Shoreline Protection Act of 2008. That also does not generate TMDL credit, but it comes into play in stabilizing shorelines by requiring non-structural stabilization techniques.
Okay, thank you.
And of course, those apply in critical area.
And Alderman, just a quick delay. One of my amendments, well, a few of the amendments do make changes to the IDA to kind of increase the
I
standards.
saw that. And actually, I skipped two of my paper clips, so
No.
I'm skipping to page 19, but really the thing I want to speak about is at the top of page 20, and this is in 2154-100, development requirements and resource conservation areas, and at the very top of page 20, what should show up but bed and breakfast, which made me ask, should we have something similar for Airbnbs? No.
I'm trying very hard to keep that out of 21, Ross. You keep thwarting me.
Well, I know, but it is strange that we would be specific to bed and breakfasts, but not have anything of animals of a similar nature like Airbnb. So
It is strange. I can only say that this is from the model ordinance, and it must have come up in state law at some point,
Okay.
and that is why we've included it.
Well, we could include it as
amendment
more
number
strict.
30.
Probably because of bed and breakfast in St. Michael's that are on the wall.
Yeah, right. That's probably right. Well, I'm actually what I'm demonstrating is I really did go through the entire side by side. So no, I did. That really did pop up on page 24. It says this proposed subsection is a part of the buffer management application code, but is not in city code. I'm assuming that means that this does put it in city code, because there's quite a bit that we've added. So that's very robust, and I certainly appreciate that. So that confirms that. I go to page 37, water-dependent facilities, and trying to remember what my question was here. It might actually, I guess, page 40, we talk about industrial facilities again. New, expanded, or redeveloped industrial facilities and the replacement of these facilities may be permitted only in those portions of the IDA, if it's, I guess, a mix IDA and less developed and so forth. Then this is what attracted my attention, and I sent an email to Terry Lomax to ask him if the Maritime Advisory Board had been aware of all of the things that are related to marinas, which starts on page 41, talks about expansion of marinas, and there's a lot of things that are related to marinas. Maybe the MAB also would be, the port wardens. But on page 42, I have an actual question there, but it looks like for a single dwelling unit, the number of slips is limited to 1 per 50 feet, but then you get into marinas and we get a different allocation up to 15, 16 to 40, and so on. And I really didn't fully understand what was going on in this section. I didn't know whether there's something you could do to help me understand
That is
what's going on.
existing language in our code?
No, in the new. I've only focused on the new. I assume the existing is.
No, it is in our code currently.
Oh, it is? Okay.
Yes, yes.
Oh, all right.
Yeah.
So.
That doesn't mean it's not confusing.
Right. So in the new tables on page 43, we talk about platted lots or dwelling units in the critical area. I'm trying to figure out how this translates to marinas, or is this dealing with marinas? But if you have a platted lot of 15 dwelling units in the critical area, you can have 15 slips, 1 for each lot? Is that what this is telling us? And then if you have 16 to 40, would this be like Watergate? Would it control the number of slips that Watergate Village could have? Because something can have over 300.
Hi, good afternoon. If you look at page 42, it talks about the number of slips or piers permitted, and it's the lesser of number 1 or number 2.
I see.
So it depends, you have to have a certain amount of lineage along the water.
Okay. So this would actually control the number of slips that, like Watergate or Severn House could have on Back Creek.
Yeah, it's really
Okay.
kind of referencing like subdivisions. So if you create a new subdivision and you like it says, 15 lots or whatever, do
Right.
you have enough lineage to create the 15 slips or not?
Okay. So that answers that, and it is the same as the existing language, so it's not really a change. Let's see, I had some questions on page 50, looking at all of the different grandfathering provisions. There seem to be a lot of different dates, like 1989, 1985. Is that just what carried over from existing code and we just stuck with it? Okay, all right.
Yes.
Okay, I just was kind of curious. Some of them are somewhat contiguous with the maritime zoning. They seem to bound it. Page 55, and this one again is for the committee too, but I always have a hard time in variances when we use unwarranted hardship. And I was wondering if we don't have some criteria that could be more specific about what does and doesn't constitute. In other parts of the code, we say that financial things do not constitute a hardship. So, but this just says unwarranted hardship. It's feels pretty open-ended.
I can assure you that critical area variances are pretty difficult standards to meet, and the applications go to the Critical Area Commission for their input from their staff as well.
Okay. And you think they're pretty tough on,
Yes.
somebody can't say it's an island and I want to build a lighthouse on it, and I would have a hardship if I didn't do it.
I'm kind of curious, Director Goddard, with your environmental law background, have you seen any kind of other language used that would be stronger, or do you think
I mean, you can define it, obviously it's the best way to do it, but what Ms. Goodini is, we discussed this with our Director Nash and I did, and, it is, she went through the process, and it is a pretty rigorous process by which these variances are granted. They're not inclined to do so. They approach it very much with the mindset of not granting and then working back. It seems, wouldn't you say, Cynthia, that's pretty much the way they their approach is not to grant, but to rather protect. Yes, so obviously, as a lawyer, I would define that, but I think the process in and of itself takes care of that concern.
But can financial be an unwarranted hardship?
I've never come across one where someone was using financial hardship for a variance. Most of our variances for the critical area buffer are for structures that already are located within the 100-foot buffer, and so they're trying to sort of naturally expand if it's a smaller house and grow as generally they do. It's not generally because they're not going to grant you a variance for if there's nothing in the 100-foot buffer and now all of a sudden you want to put it there, unless there truly is some other extenuating circumstances that says, hey, there's no way to be able to build on this buildable lot,
Yeah.
So it's pretty rigorous.
I think, Alderman Arnett, you're thinking about along the lines of some land use law that says unwarranted hardship could be where there's absolutely no feasible use of the property.
Right.
That kind of thing. I think that's what you're
Something
looking
like
for.
contours or things like that, but not just I can't make as much money if I don't develop in the IDA.
Yeah.
They're not going to grant a variance for
No, and
for
you
that
can't,
reason.
under other laws, you can't, that's not allowed either.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know if it would cause any issue to add that, that you can't do it for financial reasons, but they're pretty rigorous now, if you're more comfortable.
Although to meet critical area variance, don't you also have to meet the standards for a regular variance, or no? Oh, okay. Okay, then never mind. Because in our other variance section, we do have language about how the variance can't be granted solely for financial gain. I don't see that in this one.
See, I like that. Because that's what we run into most often
That's
is the
something that could be
excuse for
added.
wanting the variances. It's going to cost them more money or they can't make as much
I
money.
think, though, the unwarranted hardship is such a high barrier to reach that I think it sort of subsumes that category. But, yeah, I don't know if we probably should define unwarranted hardship. I think it's defined in state law, but I don't believe it's defined in our code. Do you know, Tom, you haven't seen unwarranted hardship? Yeah.
No, because I'm not aware. Even under the Forest Conservation Act, where we use those, it's still not defined there either.
Well, I would put to the committee, this is somewhat of a policy question. I do like the idea of looking at how we define hardship in other sections of the code and see. I like things where there's some criteria, and it always ends with, but not limited to these, so there is an opening, but, criteria would be that the land would be undevelopable, which of course doesn't bother me particularly much, or without doing, so on. So I'll leave that to come back to for the committee, but I kind of like less open-ended.
Right, you'll have to mull that over, but Cynthia was just pointing out that if you read one very carefully of the variance criteria, it does specifically say there have to be special conditions, circumstances peculiar to the land or structures involved. So that is another factor that makes it so very limiting in addition to the standard of unwarranted hardship.
Well, that raises the question, though, is the criteria 1 and 2 or 1 or 2? Because
There's 7 criteria.
right,
You look on
okay.
page 56, and you have to meet
So
all 7
after
of the
6,
criteria.
it says and, okay.
Yeah.
All right, I got you.
Well,
right.
I'm looking at code 2128-050, which is Title 21, Division 2, Administration and Enforcement. Under the variances section, I don't know if this applies to all the variances within 21, but it says the purpose of the variance is not based exclusively upon a desire to increase financial gain.
Alderman Savage, I believe there's something in there that says that you follow, if it's a critical area variance, you follow the variances specifically under the standards listed in 2154.
Which was it, 21, 28, 50?
Yeah. I'll put that on the list. We can talk about as a committee.
Yeah, it's, as I said, no good deed goes unpunished when I read it. Just- Next to last one is on page 58 at the bottom, the delegation of authorities from the Board of Appeals to Planning and Zoning. And I was just curious why we're taking from Board of Appeals and giving to Planning and Zoning. That's not a criticism, it's just I'm curious.
That's in the current code, and that only applies to single-family structures that are doing expansion that's parallel to their current structure. Okay. So if you're adding an addition and you're not going any closer than your current structure is to the water, then you can then it be looked at administratively. Again, it goes to the Critical Area Commission for review as well as city staff.
Okay, so if Mr. Conlon doesn't like the P&Z determination on that, he can then appeal to the Board of Appeals? Just protecting that. Last one is...
We don't get very many of those either.
No.
Those are few and far between.
Okay, you will. Page 62, on the lot consolidation. Do we get, I mean, I know this was one of the issues with the split zoning, if you'll remember, Dr. Nash, with Alderwoman Finlayson was asking about language to consolidate lots, and I think that's an issue with Crystal Spring now, whatever it is. Do we get a lot of these kinds of things where we're consolidating lots in the critical area, and is that something that we need to be worrying about?
It's not something we need to be worried about. We have made an effort, especially when once Pete Gutwell was here, that if a parcel, piece of property is made up of several parcels and they redevelop, that we make them consolidate those lots into one parcel. So we're trying to avoid some issues with that. But when we do that in the critical area, there's a set of standards that we address. And again, that goes to them. They look at it and put their 2 cents in.
Again, I want to thank you. I mean, I know this was a lot of work, but it made it so much easier for me. I know you think it made it easier for me to ask pesky questions, but I think it was, it took something that was very intimidating and made it a lot easier to understand. So I appreciate those efforts.
Well, Pete made me do it.
Well, thank you, Pete.
Yes.
We'll have to have
I was
another...
not going to do it, but he made me. But I'm glad that he made me do that, because it also made it easier for us to identify places where, it wasn't exactly what we wanted and to clarify that. So.
We'll have to have another appeals case that brings him back here. All right, well, thank you for that.
All right, Alderwoman Tierney?
Thank you. Trying to think of the objective here, and when you look at a project in a critical area, one of the most important things to look at is the sloping. And can you speak to where we are with that, and if the sloping, I guess the word is, are we addressing sloping more severely than we have before? I guess it's a question for Cynthia.
I'm assuming you're talking about steep slopes and development on steep slopes?
Developmental steep slopes is tongue twister.
So currently in the critical area, there's 3 designations. There's IDA, which stands for intensely developed areas, which is pretty self-explanatory. LDA, which is limited development areas, and you're allowed to do less development there. And RCA, which is resource conservation areas, again, kind of self-explanatory. So in steep slopes in the LDA and the RCA, and critical area considers steep slopes a slope of 15% or greater, you cannot develop on those slopes without a variance. So the variance requirement, keeps people from developing on those, and they'd have to have a good reason to need to develop on steep slopes otherwise. In the IDA, currently there isn't any regulation that states that you can't develop on the steep slopes, but Alderman Savage has proposed some amendment for that. And also he has proposed to not only stop development at the edge of the steep slope, but to expand it a little bit more. I can't remember off the top of my head if you're on a smaller lot, maybe I think it was 5 feet, and then if a bigger lot, you have to expand it further so that you're not trying to take the development right up to the edge of the steep slope, which has been somewhat of a problem where staff has to argue with some of the engineers to say, okay, you're staying out of the steep slopes, but how can you really develop all the way up to that edge? So that, I think, is a good amendment to add, a good addition.
Okay. And I know we're going to address the amendments later on, but could you explain how, in your review, Cynthia, a project comes in and you overlay the mapping. So when we start increasing per an amendment the limits of disturbance, if you will, like in certain language where we say that you just suggested so much off of the base of the slope, and so how do you decipher then the limits of disturbance with those added requirements?
That would be like any other kind of like setback that you would expect to see on a plan. So they need to show the steep slopes. So then if we require a buffer to those slopes or a setback from those slopes, you would expect them to draw that. And then, we catch that where, even for regular setbacks where people should show those setbacks, they don't often or always do that. But then we know that there's a setback and we look at that when we look at the plans.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on the underlying ordinance for staff? And I also want to thank you for putting together the spreadsheet, and also with my amendments that went for meeting to talk about them. I thought it was very helpful. I've gone through a couple of revisions of this based on the input I've received from staff, and I like to think it made them a lot stronger and more sensible, I think, in many ways. So I guess jumping into those, my colleagues each have a copy with. Now, the first copy that got posted online is different because at the time I was trying to get that finished before, I think, the Rules and Government meeting. But then I received some additional comments from staff, and so I've tried to address many of their concerns in here. And I think they may have some additional amendments regarding just some corrections to some references, code references.
Oh, Tom.
Yes.
The Planning Commission, did they have any amendments, or did they just review the base legislation?
They did not have any amendments.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. Yeah, thank you. All right. So, and just as a broad, general idea of where I was going with the amendments is, so the way it works, and jump in if I misstate, staff, but on parcels that are, obviously all these parcels are right next to the water, but if they're large enough where a portion is within the critical area and a portion is within the Forest Conservation Act, staff can use critical, and this is state law, can use critical area for the entire parcel instead of Forest Conservation Act. So now we've updated the Forest Conservation Act. In some instances and in some ways, the Forest Conservation Act is a bit more strict. Not in all ways, but in some. And so what I was trying to do, originally I was kind of raising the standards for all lots, no matter the size. But again, as I spoke with staff, it made more sense to just kind of focus on the large lots, the 40,000 square feet, because those are the ones that would be impacted by forest conservation. And so, again, I'd rather have, and at least in my mind, and I think even maybe the state's intention is critical area, I think, is even more important than the forest conservation area because it's right next to the waterways. And so, again, that's why I'm trying to raise some of the standards. And one of the big areas which Amendment number 1 addresses has to do with just including ephemeral streams. And so just for my colleagues, I guess, to clarify the differences in the stream types, if you may not know, perennial streams are things like Patuxent River, Patapsco River, but also smaller rivers that have water all year round. Intermittent are ones that they only have water kind of in the spring when the groundwater is high, so you may see them dried during certain periods of the year. Ephemeral are really channels that are only wet after it rains, and so they feed into, and so they feed into the intermittent and then into the perennial streams. So they do have ecological value in that regard because they are kind of the first level of where the water gets intercepted. And we've seen some sites, as a couple of examples, Rocky Gorge and Parkside Preserve are two sites that have ephemeral streams that are really integral to the site. And in the past, staff has used, I think that both of those are forest conservation, I believe. And so staff use those forest conservation to kind of protect and protect buffers around the ephemeral streams in some cases. And with Parkside Preserve, that stream flows right into Quietwater's Park, and then they actually drain some of the wetland networks on the site. So that's just to provide an example of like the function that ephemeral streams can provide.
But while we're there, because a big topic, and this is a big topic that Jim Urban always had, but were pools, including vernal pools, which was in vogue and discussed much at Crystal Springs. So what's the difference between a vernal pool and an intermittent pool or an ephemeral pool? And do we need to be thinking about pools as well as streams?
So the pools are considered wetlands. And
Right.
so you've got kind of two types of wetlands: tidal wetlands, which for the most part are what you're going to see in the critical area. And then you have non-tidal wetlands, and those all fall under the jurisdiction of the state.
Swamps.
Well, yeah, but also the state has jurisdiction over those. And so in terms of vernal pools, that's a type of non-tidal wetland, and they hold, kind of indicated by the name, they hold water in the spring, often in the winter, and they're vital for like amphibian habitat. And so the state they do have separate laws that protect vernal pools. I don't think we have anything in the Forest Conservation Act that specifically mentions vernal pools.
Not specific. The only one across one is.
Yeah. That's a good question, though. But I think that would fall under the non-tidal wetland protection anyway. We could increase the protection for vernal pools if there, and I think that's a good idea. If there are any, and we only have one, I guess, at the moment, but new ones do get created, as we have found out from some sites. Wetlands change shape and size. Anything you wanted to add?
Right. Well, I mean, because it is such a unique type of wetland, we've really gone above and beyond in the protection, not only in leaving it buffers, but of the water temperatures that might drain to or from it, or the amount of water draining to or from it, because the habitat that's there is very sensitive to water temperature as well as the amount of water. So we're very protective of those types of environments.
Okay.
And
Are you going to
that-
do these amendments all at once, or do you want to do them?
We could do them. Well, whatever. We could do them in order if that's, unless you want to do them all at once.
hard to do all at once.
We
Pardon?
could do them in order is probably easiest.
All right.
And I can add to the list vernal pools. I think that's a good idea. They can chat with staff more about that in the Critical Area Commission, see if we can add that. It doesn't sound like it's going to really impact too many projects at the moment, but I think it's a
So
good idea.
I would move that the committee recommend favorably on Amendment 1.
I want, as far as Amendment 1, are they mapped, the perennial, I'm hearing myself here, the perennial, intermittent, or ephemeral streams, are they mapped so we know?
Ephemeral streams are not mapped. by
So
the
that's
state.
my concern.
Yeah, that was our concern as well regarding ephemeral. And we also talked to Critical Area Commission staff, and they had concern about that too, is because it can, since it's not mapped, how do you determine that? How does a property owner determine that? Do they have to hire a professional to go out and look for ephemeral streams? If you have ephemeral stream that's not on your property, how do you do that? You can't necessarily send a professional over to your next door neighbor's property to
Time-lapse cameras.
check it
Yeah.
out. So there could potentially be some issues there with implementation.
Yeah, my concern there is my properties are, Truxton Heights, for example, in a critical area, and I don't know, my example might be incorrect, but there are limits, and then they're responsible for an ephemeral stream that they're probably not even aware of. I don't know if that opens it up to some exposure that is not known even at the time of buying a property.
That's possible.
Yeah.
And in the most
You know what I mean?
cases, when you have ephemeral streams, you also have steep slopes. So those areas will be protected by virtue of the slopes. That's just part of our argument that we were unable to convince Alderman Savage about, but that is basically our concern about including ephemeral streams.
Well, but again, I mean, that's something we've protected in the Forest Conservation Act. And so on the larger sites, I think it's feasible. They have to do a lot more engineering and surveying work. And also, just want to point out that intermittent streams, it's not about what's mapped. Oftentimes, intermittent streams aren't even mapped. And those are things, that's why it's important to have these bigger sites hire environmental consultants to do independent, supposedly independent, wetland delineations or forest delineations or natural resource inventories. And within those they'll be mapping specifically what's on the site, because especially the state maps are kind of done from a large, higher up standpoint. They don't always catch the stuff in detail.
I think for the most part, we can live with ephemeral on the 40,000 square feet, but Amendment 1 does apply to all areas.
Well, I kept it in there because, let's see here. This is under the section, where's the title? Development requirements generally.
Yeah, boy, it goes way back. 2154-060, yeah.
So this is all development activities that shall cross or affect streams shall be designed to, because I think it's important, even on smaller sites, if there is an ephemeral stream that's evident or picked up by staff or somebody that's looked at in terms of reducing flooding frequency, because we've had a lot of issues lately with development that's contributed to more flooding and runoff. But also if there happens to be a stream, ephemeral stream this I think serves to provide goals in terms of retaining tree canopy, providing natural substrate, and minimizing adverse impacts. I see this as a bit, maybe staff correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I read this is it's not necessarily requiring them to delineate the streams on all sites. That kind of is listed later on in the code where I call out and say it's only on larger sites. I mean, I suppose maybe it's worth rewording this in a way, but if we do that, I also don't want to lose any kind of emphasis on the sites that do map ephemeral streams, that they would have to provide some of these standards for the substrate and reducing flooding, if you understand what I'm saying.
My concern as far as implementation is just that if it kind of applies to everything generally, are you then kind of making it a requirement for the smaller sites? And when someone comes in here to put a deck on and they have an ephemeral stream, does that kind of affect that? And I don't know where this is kind of going. That's just my concern.
So
with
your
that.
sense is over 40,000, it's enforceable. Under 40,000, it's going to be tough. How does
I think it's very onerous on
How does
smaller
St. Luke
lots.
show up? Are they on the maps now, St. Luke's? Because that's got to be at minimum intermittent, if not ephemeral. that
There's
stormwater.
maps that show streams. I don't know if it shows every stream that's out there, but there are mapped streams that have different classifications. And
Know if it's-
And that is an intermittent stream.
It is, okay.
Could you help me out here with the review process? Tom, in planning, when you look at this, is there any sort of judgment in looking at the waterways in a specific project where my concern is, instead of being a general comment in the critical area review, is there some judgment that you can use in your site plan review that doesn't affect everyone, or is that both of you?
I'm just going to jump in here. So in the critical area, if you're in the critical area and there's an intermittent or a perennial stream, there's a 100-foot buffer on it. So then you go into the buffer regulations that protect that 100
Okay,
feet. But ephemeral streams are not in that classification. So if it's an intermittent or perennial, if it has water all the time, or during the, wet seasons, rainy seasons, then you have 100 feet off of that that's
So
protected.
don't the intermittent streams eventually tie into ephemeral streams?
Other way around.
Well, the other way around, yeah. So a drainage way.
The drainage way is
The
considered.
ephemeral stream, a drainage way would eventually tie into an intermittent
Right.
and a perennial, correct?
So,
Correct.
yeah, I just don't know if we need to say that.
Well, I have a proposal which I'm looking at Amendment 6. It essentially inserts that language into the IDA requirements, but it does it in a way where it clearly restricts it only to those sites that are 40,000 square feet or larger. So for Amendment 1, we could really just include the
6.
same language, except to say, basically include the same thing. It'll say, any project that involves development that would cross, it specifically says,
Where are you in
the
six?
page, Amendment 6,
Right, the new 6,
the new 6.
Yeah, go to 6.
right?
Yeah.
So you'll see that it specifically says that on larger, at the end of A, it says on sites larger than 40,000 square feet, ephemeral channels located on site shall also be identified.
I'm still not finding that.
This last line, on sites larger than 40,000
Oh, okay.
square feet. And then
So
it goes,
that speaks to Cynthia's point, though, that it's 40,000, it's doable, under 40, it's not.
well, that's what I'm saying. On sites larger, it'll map. This requires them to map, and then it lists underneath that.
So I'm trying to make this real to me, and I'm thinking of Ward 8, which is
Yeah.
pretty much critical area central. I'm trying to think of where the intermittent and ephemeral streams are. St. Luke's comes to mind, but that's because we just engineered it to be that. But trying to think of where else. So there's things by the SPCA that we would be thinking about.
Yeah, I believe there's definitely some streams by the SPCA.
Right.
But is this
But a lot of
really-
that's already, what's also deemed as RCA, Resource Conservation Area. There's a lot of wetlands out there. There's a lot of environmental,
So I'm wondering if we're
things there.
worried
Right.
about something.
And a lot of
that
that's
isn't.
mapped already.
yep, a lot of it mapped.
So it's either already noted or it's not particularly prevalent. I mean, I don't want to make code and work that is not going to be enforceable and is not really having any particular impact. I mean, I'll say that to you. I just don't, every time we do code that is not enforceable, I think we do a disservice to the code and to the city and to the staff and so forth. So I'm always very concerned that we don't do that. But also if it's not really very prevalent, it doesn't really exist. And maybe it's only the bigger parcels where it has a likelihood. I'm trying to think, my yard, last I knew, didn't have any ephemeral streams other than my downspouts.
Well, but again, I can change the language in Amendment 1 to clearly limit it to only sites that are over an acre at 40,000 square feet. But you do have sites like Crystal Spring, which has some critical area and some forest conservation, but it also has various types of stream on the property. And Parkside Preserve, which I think is all outside the critical area. But so you do have sites, but again, there are going to be mostly the larger ones. So I'm fine if we want to. Would my colleagues feel better if I changed the language for Amendment 1 to be matching the language for Amendment 8, Amendment 6, which clearly restricts it to the sites, larger sites?
Well, I guess I just want to be clear. This is a courtesy to our city manager, to quote Teresa, on what the objective is. It sounds like you're concerned about one particular project, and how I'm asking staff, how are those concerns currently addressed?
Right. So, Alderman, you asked earlier about what's the, I guess, flexibility in that. And typically that comes into a bit of a judgment. I think may have been the word you actually used, is professional judgment, in that the inventory is what it is. The judgment comes into the analysis of the inventory and how much of an asset from an environmental standpoint is that degree of protection, which you may just hold as standard 100-foot buffer. We may decide to expand that buffer beyond that. In most cases, we actually do expand it beyond that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a site by site, depending on what else is happening on site and proximity to other environmentally sensitive areas. Is it connected to something else and so forth?
Yeah.
Does that help you?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, yeah. Bingo, bango. I think I'd rather be that way and do this than have it pigeonholed and then affecting what we don't need affected. Does that make sense?
Well, Alderman, the point, again, one of the points is that we currently have protection for ephemeral streams in the Forest Conservation Act on those larger sites.
Yes,
You can't have a weaker standard for the critical area, which is what we currently have.
Is that true, though? Is that a true statement? No, I mean, I am confused on the relationship between the forest conservation and critical areas.
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. On Parkside Preserve, on Crystal Springs, many of the larger projects, Forest Drive Corridor, we've found these environments.
But
The Forest Conservation Act applies to the 40,000 square foot and larger lots.
Yes.
correct, so it defaults to the forest conservation. So why do they need to?
When you're outside of the critical area.
If you have
But you're
both-
in critical area, you want, to Rob's point, when you're within critical area, right now, it does not equal in non-critical areas of forest conservation.
Forest conservation doesn't apply to critical area. Once you're in the critical area, then the critical area regulations apply. So what Alderman Savage is trying to do is to make what's required outside of the critical area for the large lots of 40,000 square feet apply to the large lots within the critical area.
That's what she said, yes.
And there's a
that's-
reason.
And
I hear
currently,
you.
forest conservation does protect ephemeral streams in FCA.
Does, yes.
So that's what he's trying to do.
Yeah, and just, again, we can have sites that have both critical area. If the whole site's not in a critical area, then, and part of it's outside of the critical area, and the part that's outside, you can use the Forest Conservation Act
Sure.
to do that. But the way the code's worded is you can also just, if part of the site's in critical area, you can review the entire site using critical area instead of forest conservation. So if you use an entire site with critical area and you're throwing FCA out, then you're kind of losing environmental protection because the critical area doesn't meet the Forest Conservation Act in certain regards. And that's what I'm trying to do.
So I see that point. Is that true if a project is partially critical area and forest, but the critical area covers it all then?
Yeah, because usually critical area regulations are more restrictive than Forest Conservation Act.
I don't think the amendment, the legislation now applies to all development, no matter what the size.
Amendment 1.
No, the G, section G, where this is going to show up. So I don't think you can say all development activities that shall cross or affect perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams on lots larger than 40,000, because that now makes all those 1 through 4 affect only lots larger than 40,000. So I'm saying, I don't know how you can get this notion in.
Well, that's where Amendment 6 kind of does that, but where
can we
it
just
defines what type of stream each site has to kind of,
Right, so does Amendment 6?
what standard they have to follow.
Make
So do we need it in this section at all, because it will automatically apply to larger lots, because that's how ephemeral streams are in the definition applying to 40,000 square feet. So this says streams. Do we need to specify the number, the kinds of streams here? I'm not sure.
And we do have a section that defines ephemeral stream.
Oh, that's a good
later.
point. That's a good point. Yeah, okay.
So maybe we should,
Yes, that's a really good point. So we don't even need Amendment 1 then, because it's
so-
already defined. Thank you.
all right,
All right, so, yeah, no action then on,
right,
all right. Amendment 2,
it's on the same page.
Can I ask a question? So is there, this is kind of global, but is there language in the code to say whichever, if you're in a project like that has two, under forest conservation and critical areas, is there language to say whichever is the more strict in a certain case where forest conservation is more strict? I mean, that would cover Rob's concern.
What the Forest Conservation Act says, Alderman, is it allows, if you have a parcel that's more than 50% in the critical area, to utilize the critical area regulations for the entire parcel, and it says may. We don't have to,
Okay.
not must, yes.
So again, it does get into a judgment there.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think we should get rid of that judgment. You know what I mean? I mean,
well, I mean, personally, I don't think that,
you could,
I think it should,
I mean,
from an environmental protection standpoint, I don't think we're going to want them to go use any kind of weaker.
no,
like
that's,
like
no,
Cynthia
we
said,
agree,
though,
we
in
agree.
many ways the critical area is
More
stronger, but
I think we agree on
that's
that.
I'm trying to close the loop, and yeah. But the way this is worded, it does still have the may is still in there, but at least in this case, it's going to bring both regulations up to the same point, more or less.
Yeah. And I just don't know if you want to do that, because every job is different, and it might, I mean, every, topographically, every job is different, and I think you need that judgment to see which one applies more stringently in the interest of the environment.
Are we discussing any particular amendment at this point?
No, I'm just being philosophical.
Well, all right, we can put that on the.
Tom, would you like to expand on my philosophy? I don't know.
We might be here for a while.
Yeah,
All right,
I
so
like Amendment 2.
Amendment 2 adds something to that list of.
It changes minimize to avoid, which is much stronger language.
Yeah.
And then it adds what Ellie was speaking about earlier about the steep slopes. But it adds this concept of highly erodible soils. So I guess I'd be interested in staff reaction. This appeals to me, but again, is it enforceable? This is on page 9, lines 16 and 17.
As an FYI, that also is language coming from the Forest Conservation Act, highly erodible soils.
Right. I noticed that throughout the word. I like the idea of trying to pull the two into a parallel.
We didn't really have any comments on that, except we were philosophically pondering the meaning of avoid and what that means. Does it mean we're practicable? Does it avoid under all circumstances? But I mean, so does minimize. So, that's language for you.
Well, so what did you conclude? I mean, minimize means,
We're comfortable with avoid if that's you know, if that's the direction you want to go. I think we were just wrestling with what is this going to mean practically speaking when we tell people, oh, you must avoid that that steep slope.
To me, it sounds stronger. Minimize means you have to do something, but you don't have to do a lot. Avoid says you really need to try to not let this happen in any case.
That makes sense.
So it is stronger in my interpretation of the word.
Yeah, I don't know if there's any legal difference on that, but I mean, I think
I think avoid is strong enough there. I think it's clear. And the only thing about that amendment, it says, unless you're avoiding impacts to steep slopes and highly erodible soils, unless performing restoration activities. Does that mean you don't have to avoid disturbing them if you're doing restoration activities? You might want to word that a little differently.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think because I think a lot of people would, and I think we've seen this where some people
It
call
can get
slope,
disruptive, yeah.
they call completely regrading their slope as restoration activities.
Right, and I don't know that Public Works would agree with some of the things that are
Yes,
done.
what I was thinking is specifically stream. Maybe I'll just how about
Drop that.
well, I think how about insert stream and just stream restoration activities.
Unless you're doing stream restoration.
So after performing, just put stream.
Stream restoration is a good term to add. However, there is the restoration project at the Ellen Moyer Park, which isn't real. It's really more stormwater management restoration. It's not really a stream again.
Okay.
So, yeah, so it's kind of a
stormwater
stormwater management restoration.
We'll say stream and Moyer restoration.
Stream and shoreline restoration. Well,
I
that's
think
also opens it up.
stormwater management, you need those words in there as well.
Performing stormwater management restoration activities.
Okay.
Stormwater management, restoration.
Yeah, we just want to be careful
Yes.
that, everybody doesn't
still
start using
think-
stormwater management restoration
Right,
to.
and I think what we aim for in all of our projects, whether the restoration activities or development, is to avoid impacts. So again,
Yeah.
I come back to my point, regardless of what you're doing here, you should be avoiding impacts, whether it's a restoration project or not.
So are you suggesting that it may not need to be said? I think that's what you're saying,
Yeah,
Rob.
I am. I'm trying to think of a better way to say this right now.
So I don't know where we are at this point.
Well, I think
He's trying to say that, when you're doing restoration work, that there may be impacts to the steep slopes while you're doing it.
Is
Yeah,
that
I'm
something
just-
that we want to give a little
Right.
thought to as far as the wording and come back?
we could, because what I'm thinking is, just in my experience doing stream restoration, sometimes you do have to
You
completely
change-
reroute the stream.
Right, you change the flow.
And you may have to
Right.
cut through an existing slope that's just legacy sediment or something that's accumulated.
We have added a specific definition of restoration too, so that might help. It
Oh, you have?
is
Is that the beginning?
means the act of returning a site or area to an original state or any action that reestablishes all or a portion of the ecological structure and functions of a site or area. So it couldn't just be used to justify something if it didn't meet that definition.
Okay, so we could just keep it as is then, right? Restoration. Okay.
All right.
Any thoughts on?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good on
Okay.
that.
A general question, is there a time sensitivity to are we getting ready to time out on this legislation or? No, I didn't mean today.
I thought you
There's
meant
a
today,
time,
too.
for
No.
there is a time for the map adoption, but we still have, I believe, a year, one more year.
Well, we
We
can
had
take
2
that.
years. That was,
No, it's on, I
wasn't
think
that
it's on the next
November or
agenda.
September? We have, I think, a little bit less than a year.
I think it would be on the next.
The maps in 2018?
It still hasn't gone through rules yet.
We're really cramming that January meeting, Ross.
Right.
It has.
Well, but we haven't
They haven't
never
gotten
got
to
to
it.
it
Yeah, but it still would be,
on the
have to
agenda.
be on the agenda, I believe it's December 9th.
Well, 2 of the 3 rules people are here.
Yeah.
And I have a feeling that it wouldn't be hard to get rules to say we defer to what environmental matters did, rather than do it all.
Ah, we remembered.
Talk to shit
We,
about that.
group effort.
so-
We have a
should've
little bit
invited
less
her
than a
here
year.
today.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we should. All right, so any motion on Amendment 2?
So are we good with the way it is?
Yeah, because of the
All right,
definition. think
I
it
move,
works.
we recommend favorably to the council amendment 2, as written.
In answer to your question, we have about a year left to
Okay.
work on this.
Okay,
Or,
so we'll go with that. I second.
Okay, all those
Little
in
less than
favor? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right, amendments?
I move unanimously amendment 3.
Oh, second.
There isn't one.
No, it was removed. I forget what it was, but
Three morphed into, the old 3 morphed into 4.
I think it was something staff said. All right, Amendment 4. This adds a new requirement for intense development areas. It just kind of adds certain requirements for wildlife corridors, forested development, woodlands, streams and their buffers, steep slopes,
But you
going down the
struck,
list.
back in B, 1B, you struck that introductory clause, or sentence, the developer shall incorporate a wildlife corridors system into the site?
Yeah, because it's stated further on.
Okay.
It's
So that's just an editorial change, but then down here at the bottom of the page, there's a lot of, under 3 streams and buffers, A, we're adding and intermittent streams on all sites, including ephemeral on sites larger than,
yeah, that's again just an effort to only require the protection around ephemeral on the larger sites.
so it's 100 feet for perennial and intermittent and 25 feet for ephemeral?
Yeah, originally I had 50-foot buffer, but as Cynthia pointed out, the critical area already requires a 100-foot buffer on those, so I didn't want to make it lower.
Okay, well, I was good with this amendment originally, and these seem fine. I guess I'd look to the staff. You work these changes out with staff?
Yeah,
Have they seen them?
not the most recent change. I don't think they've.
Do they have red line copies?
Yeah,
So the more recent is the red?
yeah.
So we're retaining existing tree canopy within the stream buffers?
Well, so this it strengthens the environmental protections within intense development areas. So, for example, if you have an IDA site that is currently built out, it's not going to change things. But
Right.
if it's an undeveloped IDA lot, then they would still have to have a certain amount of protection in this case, and it's still much more rigorous for the other resource conservation and the LDA areas. But this, at least, I think, in my mind, brings some additional protections to the IDA.
Could you give me an example of a 25% slope versus a 15% slope? Any?
So most people looking at a 15% slope wouldn't say, oh, that's a steep slope.
Right,
Okay, so think of a house that you come in on the first floor, but you have a walkout basement.
Right.
So you have a slope coming from the first floor down to the basement area in the back. That potentially could be a 15% or greater slope, but you
Right.
wouldn't look at that and say, wow, that's a steep
Right.
slope. 25% slopes are pretty obvious.
they're
So they're much-
obvious. Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Difficult to navigate, yeah.
And keep in mind this steep slope language is what this is in the current code, 25%.
Yeah, I know.
slope. The 15% slope, I do mention it, I think it's for RCA and the LDA areas, but only if there's highly erodible soils either on the slope or immediately down the slope of 15%, because Ms. Genius is right, it's not super noticeable, but if there's highly erodible soil, I think there might be reason to. Oops, I'm off mic.
So if the staff don't have problems with Amendment 4, I'm fine with it.
Well, the streams are mentioned again. I'm just not sure if they're coordinated with us, with our action on Amendment 1.
So this language I pulled is the language that,
The red.
well,
look at the
ignoring
red.
the red, the language comes from the language that's currently underneath the resource conservation and the LDA, the limited development areas. And so it kind of takes that language and puts it in the IDA, but adjusts it to include the ephemeral streams on these larger sites. I didn't completely reword this. I tried to use the existing language.
So I'll refer to staff on this if they had time to look at it.
So as far as the buffers that are mentioned, there's already a 100-foot buffer required for perennial or intermittent streams. So the addition here would be the ephemeral streams on lots of 40,000 square feet or greater, and then, so you'd have to identify those. And then Alderman Savage is asking for that to be identified, and then for a 25-foot buffer off of those streams.
Yeah, and for comparison, in the forest conservation, stream buffers are, it's a minimum 50 feet, but I think we bumped it up to 100, or I'm trying to remember, but I think staff can increase it up to 100 and some feet.
I think we did up to 100.
But ephemeral, and so non-tidal wetlands have 25-foot buffers per state law. And that's where I kind of got the idea for the 25-foot buffer on the ephemeral streams. Any concerns from staff about that for the larger sites?
No, I don't think so. You know, if you're set on doing ephemeral streams on the larger lots. I will note that there is a little bit of difference with critical area and the way stream buffers are done by the state. As mentioned earlier, there's like classifications, and then you have to go out so many feet to protect those streams. And then it's based on the slope of the bank, but you go from the center of the stream. In critical area, the buffer is measured from the bank. It's not measured from the center of the stream. So it actually adds a little bit more than what the state kind of would look at too. So I would assume that we would keep that consistent for the 25-foot too, is measure 25 feet from the bank, whatever we would consider the bank. Yep. Yeah.
So does that mean we need to change anything here?
No, it doesn't mean we need to change anything. It's just
So I would move, I would recommend.
Trying to confuse you guys.
That we recommend favorably to the council amendment number 4 as reworded.
Yeah, I second that. I don't think it will be applied too many times. I mean, I don't know where it's applicable. It doesn't seem like it's going to apply a lot. But that's okay.
It may not.
As far as the 40,000 square foot lots, I was
Yes.
mentioning, so generally the 40,000 square foot lots, you're looking at war door, because those are bigger lots. Potentially lots that have been, multiple lots have been combined into one lot.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you exactly where those are, but, maybe over in Admiral Heights or
Right.
somewhere where you've had someone say, okay, I want to buy 3 lots and put a house on that and have a bigger lot. I did say that maybe that's something we want to take a look at. Maybe either Eric in our office or Sean Wampler could do some GIS search and see what that would potentially apply to, how many sites we're really talking about.
Yeah, I think that'd be good we could bring that to the whole council in case that question comes up.
Yeah.
Does GIS have contour lines? So you could really probably pretty much guesstimate where a potential intermittent stream could be, right? Using GIS.
With aerial imagery, a lot of times you can tell where perennial and intermittent streams are. The ephemeral, again, are a little harder because they're drainage ways and
Hence
not.
the word ephemeral.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
So-
with ephemeral channels, I mean, when you're doing the delineation, there are certain marker indicators you're looking for to delineate something as a stream. All right. Oh, all those in favor?
Aye.
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 That's Amendment 4. Amendment 5.
I like Amendment 5, but do we define habitat protection area? I don't really know what it is.
I just, on this
It's
one,
defined in the law.
I feel strongly, though, that, do we really have to say this? It's really unfortunate that we have to say that. I just want your opinion. Is that, we actually have to codify to protect habitat? That's
I think
depressing.
we actually do.
I understand your intent, of
Yeah,
course.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
just, that's just depressing to me if people need to codify that.
Poor little chipmunks.
Well, it's more than just what you're thinking. I'm scrolling to the definition.
It's to protect sensitive species, including plants.
Of course.
And their habitat. That's
Right.
what it's designed to do. And it is defined in the law.
Already in the law? So it doesn't need to be amended?
The definition's already there.
The definition's already there. So what's listed in the current definition as the 100-foot buffer, non-tidal wetlands, habitat for threatened species, endangered species, species in need of conservation, plant habitat, certain plant habitats, those are all defined by the state. Wildlife habitat.
2172 now, or?
These reference Comar.
Okay.
And that's another thing which I think gets corrected in here somewhere.
We do have a definition for habitat protection area in 2172.
Yeah, and I think there's another amendment that deals with the definition.
So I move we recommend approval of amendment number 5 to the city council.
Do you have any questions, Alderwoman?
No, it's just a comment. I guess, I'm not going to say no. Yeah,
We have people poisoning bald eagles. I don't think we can assume that
I know.
the people are just going to protect things.
But yeah, and I think it's certainly implied and stated in different ways in here.
Yeah.
But this has it. I'm trying to scroll back and forth. What section is page 11?
what section?
Page 11 was in
21.54080? Is that
54.
what you're asking?
Oh, so it adds it to the
Oh, intensely.
IDA.
IDA. Is that the
where,
intent?
yeah, because I think it's stated already for the RCA and the
Oh.
LDA, if I'm not mistaken. And so this just kind of adds it in there. Like but in this case, it'd be, again, it would apply to an undeveloped IDA site, or if perchance one of these resources was on a site that was grandfathered in that wasn't developed yet. That part of it wasn't developed yet. And so the definition of habitat protection area, I do propose to change later on to add 25-foot buffers to the non-tidal wetlands and add the streams as habitat protection areas.
Yeah, because, in limited development areas, they actually add a easement to protect, a conservation easement. Okay, so now I understand why it has to be said. Does the staff have any comment on it? Are we on the same one?
Yeah,
Still on?
Amendment 5.
So I think it's
Did you
moved and
move?
You made a
seconded.
motion.
Oh, you made a motion, okay, I second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Amendment 6, I'm sorry, anything else from, it's all staff shuffling pages. Amendment 6 is, let's see, page 13. Oh, this is the one we talked about earlier.
Right.
It adds this language to, which is actually current, it's in the current code, but the way it was rewritten, it kind of removed it from the IDA code. And so this kind of just puts it back in there to clearly state that the streams have to be mapped on the larger sites.
But you took out 50 feet and said stream buffers because there's
Oh, you're right.
different buffers.
I didn't do that here. Yeah.
depending upon the type of stream.
Yeah. So the one change would be, says if any project involves development activities which would cross or affect streams, perennial or intermittent, the developer shall identify any such streams. And instead of saying and its 50-foot buffer, put end their buffer in the protection, in the project area.
Stream buffers.
Their buffers. It's a good catch. Thank you.
I move that we recommend approval of Amendment 6 to the City Council.
Rob,
Yes.
sorry, Alderman Savage. You say here, again, you have that, and it's 50-foot buffer?
Yeah, that's, I just mentioned,
Oh, you
I'm
just,
gonna
did you just
change that
correct
to,
that?
yeah, cross that out and just put in their buffers.
Okay, great.
The stream
Okay,
buffer.
just want to make sure that that's,
Yeah.
Okay. All right, I second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Amendment 7, page 15. This is the section governing the buffer, which is the 100-foot buffer, critical area.
The only comment I had on this is that the new E and other sensitive areas should really be F,
Okay.
because we already changed something to E earlier.
Good catch.
And just staff, can somebody just explain the 100-foot buffer for the committee? Make sure we're all on the same page.
okay, so I told you about the three different designations of the IDA, LDA, and RCA. On top of that's another layer of regulations for what's called the 100-foot buffer. And there's actually two different buffer designations. There's a buffer exempt area, which we're changing to modified buffer area to be more consistent with the state code and other jurisdictions. But then there's just the regular buffer. And the 100-foot buffer is measured 100 feet from mean high water, tidal wetlands, or what we call tributary streams, the intermittent or perennial streams. That's how that's determined. It's a field measured determination. They can be, the 100-foot buffer can be expanded if the 100-foot buffer hits a steep slope. Again, those 15% or greater slopes, it gets expanded to the depending on the slope percentage, or to the top of the slope potentially. And it can be expanded for highly erodible or hydric soils. Hydric soils are wet soils.
Thank you. And so the intention with this amendment is to allow the buffer. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, Ms. Gudenias, but when the buffer's expanded, it kind of just, it could, for example, if it's expanded for a steep slope, it would go to the top of that slope, but not necessarily include a extra buffer, like an extra 25 feet on top of that slope, right?
Yeah, it's generally, when you expand it for slopes, there's a calculation, and you do it 4 feet for every percentage of the slope. And then if it keeps hitting a slope, then you take it to the top of the slope. It does not go beyond that slope. It stops at the top of the slope.
Okay. And so what I was proposing is to kind of allow the buffer to be expanded to include an extra 25 feet at the top of the 25% slopes and 15% slopes that also have highly erodible soils. And then on the smaller sites that are less than an acre, that they could be expanded just to include an extra 5 feet. And maybe that's not even needed, open to again, feedback in that regard. But that's the intention with the first part of it. And then do kind of the same thing for wetlands. Except this would actually be exceeding state law in the sense that on the large sites, it would allow the buffer to be expanded to include a 50-foot buffer around wetlands. And on smaller sites, it would go back to 25 feet, which is the state law anyway.
So are you proposing something different than the language you have here?
No, that's what
No.
this
Okay.
language is. And it also includes the other sensitive areas as may be determined by planning and zoning. That language is in the current current iteration of the code, it didn't get carried forward. I kind of just tend to like giving staff some discretion in that regard if there's something that they feel is sensitive that they may want to protect.
On the smaller lots, land less than 40,000 square feet, did you mean that the buffer shall be expanded to at least 5 feet for both the 25% and 15% slopes?
Yeah, 25 feet.
It just says shall be expanded to at
Yes.
least 5 feet.
No, that's different. So on this
So what are we adding?
on
So
At
you
the
want it
top
to
of the
apply to
slope.
both types of
25 feet
slopes.
at the top, the
Yeah, 5 feet at the top of the slope.
15% on slopes that have highly erodible soils with it.
That's the end of the first paragraph.
First paragraph.
Just adding at the top of the slopes.
In line with the way the state measures the buffers from the slopes that you were talking about before?
This is adding additional to that.
But is the base point the same from,
The base point will be the same. Alderman Savage is just adding an additional 5 feet beyond the top of the slope
as the buffer?
as a buffer to it, and then on larger lots, adding 25 feet on slopes 25% or greater, and then anything 15%, 5 feet, or 25%, I'm sorry, or 25 feet if it's a 15% slope with highly erodible soils. Did I get that right? There's basically three different categories here.
Yeah.
For that one. Staff, I think, supports that.
Yeah.
And it's also in the Forest Conservation Act, I can't remember if we state 25-foot buffers, but I know it specifically added buffers when you're looking at steep slopes and priority forest. And so this kind of just
Apply to
goes
wetlands,
along,
yeah.
and this kind of just goes along the same
Yeah.
vein.
This one on the wetlands.
So I would move recommendation favorably to the city council with the amendment of adding at the end of the first paragraph at the top of the slope and amending the insert.
Changing E to F.
Staff did have a little bit of concern on the wetlands issue.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so tidal wetlands already get a 100-foot buffer on them. So this
you're
would
right.
really apply to non-tidal wetlands. And non-tidal wetlands currently from the state get a 25-foot buffer around them. Critical area regulations say that if you hit a non-tidal wetland, then if the 100-foot buffer hits a non-tidal wetland, then you expand it to the edge of the wetland. So this now expands it to at least that 25-foot buffer on the smaller lots, but also increases it to 50 feet beyond the wetland on the larger lots. The only concern that I have on that is that sometimes the state allows development within that wetland, that non-tidal wetland buffer. And if we put this on here, then we have to go to a variance to allow that. A lot of times the state will allow impact to that 20-foot buffer, and staff says, no, we disagree, we're not going to allow you to impact that buffer. So this kind of expands that, and then it also puts it to potentially a variance process. That's a little bit of my concern there. Do you have any input on that, Tom?
No, I concur with what
Yeah,
you said.
because 50 feet is like the length of this room. Just kind of visualize.
Yeah, actually, see what the committee thinks. It may just be good to take that second paragraph out because I don't want to, as Ms. Udine said, there's already a 100-foot buffer around
Well, if we do that,
tidal
then,
wetlands.
then F goes back to E. I like it.
And so would that still allow staff to
But
protect the wetland buffers for non-tidal wetland buffers?
It would still have, you still have the 25-foot non-tidal buffer. We've often said, even if the state has said you can impact it, that we've disagreed with that and said, no, you can't. So it gives us the flexibility, if they do have a good reason for impacting that buffer, that we can do it administratively, not do it through a variance.
Okay,
Okay,
all right, so
alrighty.
a new motion, I guess, to remove.
So the motion now is to recommend approval of Amendment 7 with the addition of that clause at the top of the slope in the
At the
first paragraph, eliminate the second paragraph, and everything else is okay.
Okay. Good with that? Oh, we don't need to now because we took,
Yeah, because we're dropping the
We
one
took
that
D
was
out.
going to be the new E. So now we have another new E. All right.
that wasn't voted on though. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Do I have a second on that? Okay. Okay. All those in favor, Amendment 7, recommending favorably, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, Amendment 8. It's page 20.
So this is intermittent and, no, this is intermittent and perennial.
20 is, this is the modified buffer area.
Modified buffer area, MBAs.
And so this would say, currently it says, development and redevelopment may not impact any habitat protection area other than the buffer. In this case, they're saying 100-foot buffer, including non-tidal wetlands, other state and federal permits notwithstanding. So my proposal would insert, because right now all this mentions are non-tidal wetlands, but I'd also like to throw in streams in the modified buffer area. Does staff have any concern about that? Any unintended consequences of doing that?
I can tell you that Alderwoman Finlayson will want it to read perennial and intermittent rather than intermittent and perennial, so that we keep the same order as we do, because we do perennial, intermittent, and then ephemeral. So,
Okay.
and I think that construction should be consistent.
Yeah, absolutely. While staff is
I think we're good with that one.
deliberating, oh, you are? Okay. It also includes in there 22, oops.
Stream wetland or shoreline.
Oh, and then the second part of this simply would prohibit dredged spoils from being placed in well, I guess before I get to that, any staff comments on the first paragraph? Adding streams to the modified buffer habitat protection area.
I guess, again, are we okay with the ephemeral streams in that amendment?
It's going back to the ephemeral streams on the 40,000 square foot
So we're okay?
lot.
Yeah, so it's, because it's over 40, okay. So, okay. What about the
So
second
page
part?
2, line 2. So G on that prohibits the placement of dredged soils within habitat protection areas, except as needed for backfilling shore erosion protection areas, use in vegetated shore erosion projects, beach nourishment, placement on previously approved channel maintenance. Just wanted to add in there stream, wetlands, or shoreline restoration projects that they can use dredged spoils if it's designed to do so. I don't know if there'd be any reason not to do that, or
Page 22.
I can't think of anything right now.
okay.
So I would recommend approval to the council of Amendment 8 with the transposition of perennial and intermittent to maintain that structure, and otherwise as written.
Any thoughts, Alderwoman?
No, it's just one of those where I'm kind of nervous about getting into the logistics of getting rid of the soil, but I guess if staff doesn't have any problem with that, is that,
I don't think we've ever had to deal with that situation before. I don't
That's my point is, I mean, why are we saying this?
Well, I don't feel strongly about it, but I was just looking through these uses. It allows dredged spoils to be used in some of these areas,
Yeah.
but
I don't,
but it would allow them to use dredged spoils in restoration projects if they need to bring in soils.
I strongly don't recommend this. I don't think we want to get into that, the logistics of where the spoils can be used or not. I just don't think I'm sorry, I just don't.
I understand. Yeah, I mean they do it already in the critical area. I mean, it may be a moot point anyway. So again, I don't feel too strongly about this as the rest of the committee feel.
I'm indifferent.
Okay.
So are you keeping the first amendment on page 20? But
Yeah.
dropping the one on
Drop
page
the second
22?
paragraph.
All right.
Amend your motion.
So the motion is recommend the change on page 20, but not the change on page, we'll drop the change on page 22.
Okay.
Second.
All those in favor of recommending favorably, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Amendment 9.
I just didn't want the earthwork guy to say, you told me to put that there.
That's fine. That's fine. Page 29, this is under habitat protection section of the code. So page 29, line 29, sorry, 25.
Line 30.
It says identification. This talks about how an applicant shall identify all applicable habitat protection areas, including, and then it lists all the areas that we mentioned earlier. This would essentially add the streams and non-tidal wetlands as to be a part of the
streams, right.
habitat protection areas. That
works for me. I move we recommend favorably Amendment 9 to the City Council.
any concerns from staff about that part?
No, because it's over 40,000 square feet. We're on 10, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or 9?
Oh, 9. Yeah, same logic.
Okay.
I'm okay.
All right.
So I made the motion.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. Amendment 10.
So I see you're adding the Environmental Commission, but does that get inserted before or after planning and zoning? It's on line 42.
After.
That would be after the planning and zoning director?
Yeah, it would. I guess it would put it before the plan zoning director.
We put it before? The way
That's how it's worded,
reading
right?
now. But I would think it should come after the planning and zoning
Yeah, that's
director.
fine. Yeah, makes more sense. But what about the general idea of? So the idea behind this is just on large sites. This would make the Environmental Commission aware of any kind of variance requests on these larger sites. And perhaps we can hear from Mr. Giblin if the Environmental Commission has any. Maybe they don't even want to receive these variance requests. Okay. So this would, if somebody requests a variance on a large project site, that in this case greater than an acre, that variance request, it would basically just get copied to the Environmental Commission for comments. You wouldn't have any kind of authority to approve or deny it, but I don't know, just a gesture to kind of keep them in the loop. But if you don't feel like the commission is going to want that, I don't know if staff has a reason about why you think that might be a bad idea or too cumbersome.
The
Let me
commission
know.
has voiced several times that they would like to be able to comment on projects, especially of this size, or at least review them, and if they thought it appropriate to make comments.
For the most part, we do send projects like that to them. We don't necessarily, we wouldn't necessarily send single-family projects to them, but I don't think it's a big deal to do that.
Yeah, so it's their policy to do that already. This would be codifying that practice and policy.
Is there,
I move that we recommend amendment number 10.
But I would argue that it should be, the Annapolis Environmental Commission should be inserted after the director,
Yes.
planning and zoning director.
yeah, I agree. So
Oh,
that'd be-
I see, yeah.
So you want to change it to line 43, but after, right?
Line, no, it still would be line,
Oh, it'd still be
applications for
42.
variance and administrative variances shall be made in writing to the planning and zoning director. Oh, yes, you're right, with a copy to the critical area commission. Well, where does this go?
Takia reminded me that
Oh, no, that's
it's the Environmental Commission, not the Annapolis Environmental Commission in the code.
okay. Yeah, no, this is worded right.
Okay,
Because after the, which comes after director, planning and zoning director with a copy to the Annapolis or the Environmental Commission for sites greater than 4,000 feet, and the critical area commission in accordance. So yeah, it's right. Do we need to change that to strike Annapolis?
no.
Okay, so all right, we'll just take it. So take that off of that amendment, and then
I always called it the AEC, Annapolis Environmental
I
Commission.
know they call themselves that.
That's what they call themselves. In the code, it's the environmental commission.
Okay.
And you don't want to put that in, and they don't exist
Okay.
technically in the code.
Okay. All right, I have a motion.
Yeah, so moved.
Okay, and all those in favor of recommending favorably amendment 10 as
I second it,
amended?
yeah.
Aye.
Aye. Amendment 11, which is page 32.
Okay.
Getting to the end here. And this,
Amendment 13, okay.
This kind of just incorporates language. Oh, let's see. I think it
This is
just
very
requires.
specific, yeah.
Let's see, page
It's
30.
not saying appropriate measures, it's saying granting an easement. Do we have that authority?
Well, it has an or by a conservation easement granted to the city or a landscape maintenance agreement. So I thought those just seemed. So yeah, I'm adding some specificity to the current language,
Define
which is
what
just
true appropriate measures
appropriate
means. So
measures.
there's two choices, an easement or a maintenance agreement. Is that enforceable?
yeah. I don't feel too strongly about this one either. So whatever staff feels is best.
Landscape maintenance agreement, yeah. I think we're okay with, as long as landscape maintenance agreements are an option. I don't think we have an issue. It just, it wouldn't always be appropriate to have a conservation easement, but I think we can work with landscape maintenance agreements.
But would it serve you better to have it worded in the original manner, which is appropriate measures?
Do you guys have an opinion? That's fine. Okay.
And if we don't,
We don't have an opinion.
if you don't think it's going to help you, then
Either way is fine. Yeah.
Well, let's do it then. I like specificity.
Those are both appropriate measures. That's the answer you want.
well, I think yeah.
Appropriate legal measures to protect in perpetuity, either one.
Sorry, the truck was going by.
I don't know. Are there-
Either one of those are appropriate measures to protect in perpetuity.
Are there other appropriate measures that we can't think of right now that we might
That's what we
want
were
to
trying to
leave the
think of.
original language and then?
Don't think so.
I think my original idea was I like the in perpetuity part of conservation easements and landscape maintenance agreements, which I think the way it's currently worded doesn't necessarily. Anyway, maybe we're overthinking this one. Okay. Any motion?
Well, currently the language doesn't say in perpetuity.
Right.
Either the
so
amendment
this,
or the,
So this would be in perpetuity would be implied by the amendment, which is the conservation easement, and the
yeah, that is.
landscape maintenance agreements are in perpetuity too.
They are, okay, then
Well,
I
Correct.
move,
Mr. Smith?
Not necessarily, right?
Landscape maintenance agreements in perpetuity, or?
Yes, and they now get recorded in the land records. So if the ownership of the property changes, it's there in perpetuity throughout. Yes, and
so I
enforceable.
move that we recommend favorably Amendment 11 to the City Council.
Do you have any
I second.
concern? Okay. Well, all those in favor of a favorable recommendation, please say aye.
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 Oh boy, ephemeral stream again.
Again.
Page 42.
Oh, this was probably to answer my earlier question.
Oh, this just creates a definition for ephemeral stream. It's the same definition that we have in Title 17 for the Forest Conservation Act.
All right, and is this going into 2172, or is this? I guess are we in 2172 here?
Hold on. Where are we? Page 42? We are in, where the heck are we in? Holy moly. We're in definitions, for sure. 21 point,
Yep, it
we're in
is in
terms.
2172, all right.
Yeah, we're in terms.
So pending comment from the staff, I would move we recommend favorably adding the definition of ephemeral stream.
Is one question, is that in line with the state definition? I hope so.
Yeah, I think that's what we're
doing, right? I hope, that's
where-
why I'm saying I hope so.
I'm pretty sure that's where it was pulled for the Forest Conservation
Alrighty
Act.
then. I second.
Any staff? Okay. All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right. So 13, Amendment 13, page 45, line 42. This is habitat protection area. This fixes the reference to Comar, and it also inserts streams as to be within the habitat protection area.
Is that I'm sorry, is that a correction on line
Yeah,
42?
The first paragraph is a correction, yes.
Okay.
When I looked it up in Comar, it wasn't, they were actually repealed. So I think Jacqueline looked up. I haven't checked the new ones, but I'm assuming the law office verified it.
Oh, and then,
Jacqueline Lee. Yeah, sorry, Jacqueline Lee.
I'm a Jacqueline.
So any other thoughts on this?
no, I think this is good. I mean, it
Any motion?
creates, consistency is good.
Move that we recommend favorably to Amendment 13 to the City Council.
And I second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, last one, Amendment 14, page 65. This just adjusts that definition. I wanted to specifically mention, once we actually get a greenway plan, just anticipating that we'll have one, and that'll be included in this as, what's it? This is in the definition of wildlife corridor. Yeah, so just include greenway, but also mentions the county greenway plan, since there was at least a little bit of overlap. Is there any concern with including the county, mentioning the county greenway plan? I know it's old, but.
Even though we tried.
Not criticizing, but is there a better way to reference as a greenway in any?
Maybe it's not.
So
Is there a
I
comprehensive?
move that we recommend favorably to the City Council Amendment 14.
So there's no concern about county, St. County plan?
I mean, we generally try to
Coordinate?
coordinate county plans and implement their plans
I mean, there's
to the
very
extent we
little,
can.
very little overlap except along Forest Drive. But,
Yeah.
Okay, did I hear a second?
Can we just put a word before plan in any
Oh.
city or county? What plan? Development plan? Or is there need? What plan? Does that,
Well,
you're okay with it just saying plan?
yeah, because then it could include comprehensive plan and not just a greenway plan, but if for some reason they mention it in comp plan.
Okay. Is
Or
there a
CDOT
motion?
plan.
Oh, my God. Or the ULI. Second.
So there's, okay, aye.
All those in favor, aye.
Aye.
So one
All right,
last
that's-
point to ask of the staff is the enabling clause here. It says this takes effect upon passage. Are we going to be hearing from any developments around town that are in the pipeline, that this is going to impinge upon them in some way?
But how would it affect? Right, they're not vested though. So it could affect a couple of developments. We're not sure right now exactly how it would affect them, but we can look into that if you're considering like the same kind of language you did about if the project's already in the pipeline, it wouldn't apply. But we do have a lot of grandfathering language, so that might protect them even if they're not vested, but we'll have to look into that.
But some of this with like the added buffers, you know, where you're adding buffers to the top of slopes and stuff, if there's like permits or something in under review, it could affect those. So maybe something where things that are currently being reviewed, it shouldn't apply to, because then you'd have to ask people to go back and potentially redesign.
Well, I feel it's, the onus is on the.
Right, you'd have to protect them if the language would have to be there, protect anything that's in the pipes.
Well, my colleagues know my preference. I don't like to,
I like it
I like
be
to cut it off at if they have
Right.
approval. If they already have approval, then they don't have to go back and change anything. But if they're still in the process, just because we've had, not at the fault of staff, believe me, I know, but we've had some projects going through the pipeline, through the review process for a very long period. And I'd hate to have, you know, like a project that's in the pipeline for 10 years, still comply with the old law. That's just my own personal.
Well, I think the
preference,
onus is on the applicant, but we have a lot of applicants that spend a lot of time at these meetings because they want to make sure we're not
Yeah.
backtracking and zapping them. So I think it's just something we should be aware of. The other thing I think we need to do is the new language that's in O2619, if it ever gets passed, which says that if one part of this is taken to court, it doesn't stop applying any of the rest of the parts. I'll have to get that exact language, but I'm going to recommend to the Office of Law that we do that on all of our legislation henceforth, that separability clause, whatever it is. But, all right. This isn't exactly like short-term rentals, but it isn't that far off in terms of time.
So the other thing we put on our parking lot, I guess, was vernal pool protection, which I can try to work up something. I think that's pretty
We
easy.
can do it at the meeting.
Do we want to include short-term vacation rentals in that list of prohibited uses in the
I'm going to think
RCA?
about it some more, but I got the distinct impression from Sally that we don't want to go there.
You're just all about short-term rentals.
Right, the whole world, yes. Are there any short-term rentals in the Eastport Shopping Center?
And then adding language to
I'm restraining myself.
adding language that specifically prevents variances based solely on financial gain or however. But I guess we can work on that.
Yeah, why don't we
separately.
work on that? I'd like to get this to the council
Yeah.
and on the agenda, and I think, Takia, were you saying that there are some timeout issues with this?
It should be on December 9th, so.
Oh, wow. December.
So I'm good for it to go there, and if we have some
Great news.
thoughts, we can
yeah.
bring them up at the.
One last thing,
Oh, the fees.
the Maritime Advisory Board,
Oh, do they?
do we want to refer to their next meeting isn't unfortunately until after our next council meeting.
I sent an email to Terry and advised him that there were things here. I frankly don't think it's impinging on them, but it is in their purview, probably also the port wardens, though I guess Kevin can decide that. But I don't.
There's nothing that's changing, nothing new that would affect.
Right, that's a
Okay.
good point.
That would impact either one of
Yeah.
those. Okay.
Oh, anything new, gotcha. That's good to
Okay.
know, okay.
Well,
We have to talk about fees, the next.
oh, shoot, yeah. Thank you.
I think we should increase them.
Important.
We did
All right,
have
so-
a point about that. For the fees,
Oh, Donna, before you do that, we need to do a general motion on the entire piece
Right.
of legislation.
Move we recommend favorably to the council with the amendments approved by the Environmental Matters Committee.
Second,
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All right, and so next up is our,
that's not on the agenda.
once I find it, R 3619 critical area overlay fees. And Dr. Nash, can you just give us an introduction to the fees, to this piece of legislation?
Right, so the way the resolution is written, it codifies our existing practice, and I don't have that document in front of me, but we currently charge $6.25 a square foot, $6.25 a square foot in the critical area, in the buffer. And then outside the buffer, it is $12.50 per tree, so $1,250 per tree.
And in the FCA, we charge $10.
Unfortunately, yeah, I forgot to bring copies of this, but it is posted. So again, my intention with this, with the amendment, well, actually, before I get to that, any questions about the underlying fees in the resolution as it's written?
Do we want to make this consistent with the FCA?
I would think,
If
That's
it's
my
$10.
amendments.
Oh,
kinda.
okay.
yeah,
So
that would make sense.
The amendment,
I think.
and this is what I do, I think staff had some clarification comments on this. So what I did is, if you look at, I separated into two different categories, again, based on site size.
Do you have his?
So I kept, the sites under an acre are the same
Oh, they're
as
online?
proposed.
Oh.
And then for the sites that are greater than an acre,
Yeah.
increased it to, oh, there's a mistake in here, increased it to $5,000 per tree. And I got that number just by calculating, in the FCA, a forest is considered, if it has 100 trees an acre. So I just did $100 times the fee to figure out what it would cost per acre. And so it actually works out to be $125,000 per acre as written, which is lower than the FCA, which ranges between $400,000 to $500,000 per acre. And so that
We
was
were
my
taking
thinking on that.
the FCA fee of $10 a tree, and then we were
$10 a
converting
square
that
foot.
to square foot, and we got $2,000 a square foot. Per tree, sorry. So we didn't do you
did
did your
$10 a
conversion a
square-
different way, I think.
Explain that again.
So we took the $10 per tree. I'm
$10
sorry.
a square foot.
$10 per square foot under forest conservation.
So if we use the same as forest conservation, then your buffer per square foot would be $10 per square foot
Yep.
for fee in lieu, if we're using the same as the forest conservation. And then for the critical area, you get 200 square feet of credit for a 2-inch caliper tree. So if you multiply 200 square feet times $10 per square foot, you would get $2,000 per tree.
But the other $3,000 goes to redo the city dock, right?
Right. So I understand there now.
Explain that to me again.
Cynthia, you're saying, so you, on $10 a square foot, you extrapolated if it's 2-inch caliber per 200 square foot, then each tree, assuming 2-inch caliber, would be $2,000?
Right, so under 1709, it talks about removing trees in the critical area, and it says, okay, if a tree is this big, you have to do X amount of trees. Let's say 3. You have to do 3. If you can't plant 3 trees, and those trees that you plant have to be 2-inch caliper trees. And for critical area regulations, a 2-inch caliper tree is a 200 square foot credit. So if you take 200 square feet and multiply it times the $10 per square feet, you get 2,000 square feet. That's how we worked out the current rate, that it's $12.50 a tree, and that works out to the $6.25 per square foot. And we're already currently, our fee is way higher than anybody else in the state.
What did the county just do? I don't know. I mean, I know they just approved forest bond.
I
Doesn't
can't
matter.
tell you
It's
what the
probably
county just
irrelevant.
did.
It's probably relevant, yeah.
Well, looking,
So am I drawing out all this that we would change the $5,000 per tree to $2,000 per tree? Is that what I'm hearing?
That's what we think. If you want to increase it, it should be $2,000 per tree. And if you want to make the square footage equal to FCA, that it's, if the FCA is $10 a square foot, that you make the buffer $10 a square foot.
Unless we want to make it more punitive, I guess.
I'm just looking up the code sections. I'm getting tired. I'm not quite following.
I will put this out to you, that if you make the fees so high that people will try to get the planting in there even if it's not really feasible, instead of having to pay a fee in lieu, and then you just get overcrowded planting eventually. So, you know, I think you need to kind of keep that in mind, is you don't want to force people to do planting that's really not feasible because the fee in lieu is so high.
But that gets,
And we say
Reviewed by
that
staff.
now under the current regulations.
Yeah.
that gets reviewed by staff, though. If it's
It
super
does.
dense, I imagine you can say.
It does, but, you know, you'll get people who show that it works. You know, it just, we don't want to be fighting and arguing with
I
people.
will add that the $2,000 is still a very expensive tree. When we
Yeah.
make, when our urban forester makes trees be replanted, and if people can't, it's a little over $1,300, and that's still considered very expensive per tree. So this is higher than what we require when people take down trees in the city.
I like the fact that it's mathematically in line. We can justify it. And so it doesn't appear punitive.
So what's the 2,000 number? Which one would you propose to change to 2,000?
The $5,000.
5,000 down to 2, as you're saying, is more in line. All right. I still don't, maybe it's just I'm getting tired, but I still don't follow the
In the
calculations.
critical area buffer, the calculations for mitigation is based on square footage. Okay? And so you get so much credit depending on what kind of vegetation you plant. And for a tree, you get 200 square feet for a 2-inch caliper tree. And then 1709, which is where that other number comes for
Okay.
the fee in lieu. So if you have to plant a 2-inch tree, you should get the same credit. And then based on those numbers, I can show you the math later if you want me to show you.
Okay. All right. I will take your word for it. So in the amendment for the fee in lieu, where it's listed 5,000, change that to 2,000. I mean, what are my colleagues?
2,000,
Should we
yep.
change that to 2,000?
And I don't have that, I don't have the
Three
form in
places.
front of you, but the $2,000 should be the fee in lieu for the trees that apply to trees outside the
Yeah.
buffer and for 1709.
And then for 2154-105,
Inside the buffer.
instead of $5,000 per tree, change that to 10. I thought they said 10. I thought you said 10.
Well, where it says inside the buffer and there's a buffer
Yeah.
mitigation, if it's a square footage number, we'd said it was 625 that we use right now. We want to have that at the $10 to be consistent then with the FCA.
Okay, so we're striking in the second half, striking $5,000 per tree and making that $10 per
For the larger lots.
For large lots underneath 2154-105. Are you clear, Ms. Green?
I think I'm, yeah, I think,
me
are you
show you?
clear?
Okay.
Can you give us a chance, since we don't have that form, and what you're looking at?
Yeah, I'm
in front,
sorry, I
just
forgot-
to
I
make
forgot
just
to
to
make
make sure
copies.
that we're all on the same page here, literally.
Yeah,
Just connected to the legislation.
It's on Granicus?
I don't think they have that up. I guess Sally does.
It's a weird calculation because you don't know what the density is. I mean, you basically don't know how many trees should be planted. So I think that's the assumption you have to make, that $10 square foot covers both.
The last one.
I think each 5,000 is 2,000. Yeah.
These are some long days. I don't think we're getting paid enough.
I know, oh my gosh.
I still haven't recovered from Monday.
Have you guys been approached by this sailing center at the Birders House dock? Because I'm getting lots of.
Going to be approached by it.
Wow. It's getting some of my constituents infuriated because we've waited so long for the dock.
Constituents are getting
Infuriated. Because we've waited so long to get
Okay,
the dock.
one small
Yeah.
note.
Oops.
Okay.
I'll let Cynthia take over.
Okay, so under 2154-105, for planting inside the critical area buffer, that's all going to be a square footage number. It's not going to, you wouldn't have a tree
Right.
fee in that. So so currently it's $6.25. If you want to keep it in line with what you've done above, you would keep that buffer fee for the smaller lots at $6.25, and then for the larger lots, that's where your $10 would
Right.
be.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
My only concern here is that you're penalizing these larger lots for having to do mitigation. You're charging them more for a tree and for the fee in lieu. I know you're keeping the lots over 40,000 square feet in line, but you are, in my opinion, penalizing the larger lots because you're charging them more per tree and charging them more per square foot.
Yeah, maybe so, but I guess I just don't want to penalize them any more than they would be under the FCA is what I'm trying to get at. So I don't disagree with you, but
already less than that.
well, yes, yeah. Sorry, any
Should
less.
we, what if we revert, let's just try to match it. Can we match the FCA?
Well, that's what
Yeah.
that's what they're. I think that's Ms. Gudeni. You're saying I understand your point. This is still going to penalize them, but what you've recommended would at least bring it up to the same level of penalization as.
Well, that does bring it up to the same as forest conservation, if that's what that's what your goal is with that.
Yeah.
And then it also does allow for those lots that, wouldn't be in forest conservation and have to meet those goals, it would keep that fee a little bit lower for those smaller lots.
I guess my question is, what do you allow for planting in the buffer areas?
Me?
What do you allow for planting in the buffer areas? I mean, anything? I mean,
No, it has to be native vegetation. And like I said, there's a whole
Yeah.
credit chart, a vegetation credit chart. And so when you have to do mitigation for disturbance in the buffer, then you come up with a number. And let's say you have to do 1,000 square feet of mitigation, then you do 2 trees and 3 native shrubs
Yeah.
and those type of things. There's a whole chart that
Sure.
helps you figure it out, and so you meet your numbers, and then you show that planting on a plan.
I was just,
What needs to be native vegetation?
okay. That's what I'm thinking, is that the tree cost per tree is almost irrelevant, but maybe not, I guess. It just seems like it's there, just there.
Well, the fee in lieu within the critical area, the fee in lieu is the
foot.
last resort.
Yeah.
So you're supposed to do as much planting as you can within the buffer. If
Yep.
you can't do it within the 100-foot buffer, then you do it on your site.
Yeah.
There's a third option of you can plant it within the critical area off-site, but that becomes very difficult because then you're asking someone to take your mitigation and hold that mitigation and that responsibility for that mitigation. So that's usually doesn't usually work. And then the last resort is taking a fee in lieu. And people try to avoid the fee in lieu currently because it is pricey.
Yeah, I guess that's one question. The Forest Conservation Act has a lot more options for mitigation. Do you feel like that's a reason to, is there a reason why we wouldn't want to be kind of, because one of the rationale for raising the FCA fee was to kind of force them to do the mitigation or to just protect the forest instead of clearing it and instead of paying that fee in lieu. Is there a reason to kind of treat this differently from your minds in terms of to have these, since there are less options, do we want to reduce the fees for this critical area in light of that?
I'm fine with our current fee. Like I said, we're way higher than anybody else in the state. I don't even know if anybody's anywhere close to us. I mean, a lot of jurisdictions for the buffer, it's $1.50.
Yeah.
And we're at $6.25.
Yeah, 'cause the objective is different.
So to go to $10 is a big difference. Of course, this is Annapolis. We're not talking about, out in the Eastern Shore or whatever, where the land's a little cheaper, it's a little easier to find places. But here we are also very limited for people to find places to plant. Some areas have, I'll call it like tree banking and things like that, where there's an area that's designated and you can do your mitigation there if you can't do it on your site. We don't have any of those options here in the city.
Although I think you do allow, or aren't you working on a way to allow nonprofits to utilize that money, the fee money?
That's correct. So the money will, right. So if people pay a fee in lieu, it does go into an account, and then currently what it's usually used for is tree planting within the buffer in certain areas. But we are working on an MOU to allow that money to be used not only for that, but for potentially other environmental projects, such as maybe living shorelines, other groups who want to do other types of restoration projects, that type of thing. So yeah, that money will go to that, and we're working on that so we can use that fee in lieu money for those projects.
Okay, yeah, and that's, I'm also, again, for these larger sites, I wouldn't want to be allowing them, or not allowing necessarily, but giving them some kind of incentive for the lower fee to clear more forest than they would.
The larger
under the
sites
FCA.
are larger, so they should therefore also have more space to be able to plant. That's another.
Well, I do like the idea of allowing nonprofits. That's the one difference with the FCA, is I think that's one of the benefits to having money in the fund is we can help support them. But anyway, are any other concerns?
Is it even, should we just keep it per square foot in these applications?
It's two different. There's two different sections of the code that deal with it differently.
Okay,
So
so
it's
it
within the
doesn't-
buffer, it needs to be square foot,
Oh,
and
okay,
then
you did change
then
that one. Okay.
outside.
Thank you.
So is there
Good.
a motion to kind of
You got the right numbers?
amendment number 1, which would be using, instead of $5,000, substituting $2,000,
And then the
and then for
last
the
one,
last item, instead of 5,000, it would be 10,000. I'm sorry,
$10 a square foot.
$10 a square foot.
Gotcha.
So under
Yeah.
2154, you would have two numbers, 625 for the smaller lots and $10 for the
Yep.
larger lots.
Correct.
Yep.
Okay,
Now I'm
just wanted to
happy.
make sure
Yeah.
that was correct.
You were ahead of me on
Is there a
that.
second on
I
that?
think it should be per square inch rather than.
Oh, still up.
Did I hear a second?
Second.
All right, all
Or
those
maybe I
in
did.
favor, say aye. Aye. And is there a motion for the resolution as a whole, as amended?
So move.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
And thanks again to staff. for
Thank you so
all your
much.
time. And before Director God leaves, if you have any kind of report for us, I know we're getting late here, but
I did send you last week the written
Yeah.
report I provided to the Environmental Commission. So I'll just let that suffice for now, and you can send me questions, or if you have any questions now. But Michael Giblin is here from the Environmental Commission, and he wanted to make one brief statement.
Okay.
Thanks again, P&Z.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was very helpful to iron this out.
Did you vote on the resolution?
Yes.
As amended, yeah.
Yeah. Mr. Goodwin, anything you would like to say from the Environmental Commission?
Michael
Thanks,
Giblin, Environmental Commission, 5 Park Place. One of the things that a couple of members of the commission have been working on is the resiliency work group, which is part of the comprehensive plan update. And their report is right now scheduled to be released in draft form by the end of December or certainly early January. And we would, because of the nature of the report, resiliency, there are a number of sections in that are
Mr. Goodwin, hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dr. Nash.
Dr. Nash?
Could you maybe hang out another minute or two, just in case?
It's on a comp
It's
plan.
on the city doc.
You're talking about the comp plan, not the ULI plan, right, Michael?
talking about the comp plan, yes.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
Thanks, sorry, Sally, we had to nab you.
Almost got out of here.
Sustainability plan.
I'm sorry, what, I was not listening.
No, as you know, the Environmental Commission has had a representative to the resiliency work group. Yes. Your report is due out in draft form end of December or January.
They're starting, this effort that the University of Maryland is doing, and I'm going to incorporate a lot of their work into the comprehensive plan. They're working on their public outreach strategy now. I don't think they will have the report until spring.
Okay.
Did you think that was sooner?
Julian Thoreau said early this summer,
Maybe,
early 2020. They would have a draft.
They will have a draft, you're right. They will have a draft.
And then the final report in the spring. You're correct.
Yes, that's right.
Early draft when?
Okay, so what my point was that we think the Environmental Commission should be a part of that review process. And I'd be more than happy to discuss with you how we would work with this group, the standing committee, in going through a comment process to get that and this group, and then getting those comments coalesced, going back to Dr. Nash's group.
At the last meeting, we did talk about identifying a few stakeholder groups that we needed to reach out to right away, including City Council, but also the Environmental Commission, and
Okay.
Jackie suggested Waterways Cabinet and
Conservation Board.
a few other groups like that. So
Planning Commission.
And Planning Commission, that's right. So there will be a handful of groups that will do some targeted outreach to before we go to a wider audience.
I believe we
Maritime
also said
Advisory
Historical
Board, maybe?
Preservation Commission. Historic Preservation Commission.
Maritime
I think
Advisory
we
Board,
included
maybe?
them.
Oh,
Did we?
Yes,
We'll deal with that.
I think so.
Yeah.
And what about the Maritime Advisory Board? Do you think they would have an interest in that?
They're more about business, I think, than about
Yeah,
the resiliency and
business, yeah.
sustainability planning. I think that's
I
what we
think
talked
we
about.
did talk about going to the business leaders group.
Yes.
That meets
Yeah.
once a month and has presidents of business associations come. So there would be outreach to that group.
We cover a lot with the Waterways Cabinet.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree, Mr. Gilman. I think that'd be. I think this committee and speaking for the committee, I think we would be very interested in receiving any kind of comments from the commission.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And I also want to thank you for adding us to as an amendment on your critical areas review that you just completed a few minutes ago. We certainly want to be included in that process as well.
We're also, for the comprehensive plan, we're having a meeting on December 2nd for the chairs of all the city's boards and commissions. Okay. And so I'm still coordinating with Kate, who's going to be coming from the Environmental Commission, but they will have a representative there along with all of our other boards and commissions. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to work with them to give them information to go back to their boards and commissions on identifying goals and strategies for the city to put into the comprehensive plan from their perspective.
For resiliency, correct?
No, this is actually just a general meeting for the comprehensive plan.
Okay, yeah.
So all groups, we have
Okay.
someone from the recreation board, someone from Port Wardens, someone, so all the
Yeah, we
cities' boards
talked
and
about this
commissions.
earlier this week with the Ward 1 Residents Association. Were concerned about involvement, and the way I understood was that you would want a representative from them eventually. Or
Right.
what?
In January, I'm going to have a similar meeting, but with the presidents of all the cities' homeowners associations and civic associations.
Mm-hmm.
So same kind of situation, different content, but
Yeah.
general outreach. This is what the comp plan is. This is how you can help me. If you go back to your group, get this information that will then go into the plan.
And then getting back to resiliency, a big part of that is you have the comp plan, but then you have the ULI resiliency, I guess, I don't know what you want to call it, effort. So how are you?
So for our comprehensive plan, we have three main themes. One is housing, one is public health and promoting healthy living, healthy communities, and one is resiliency. So the resiliency theme will appear throughout the required chapters in the comp plan.
Gotcha.
And each section will speak to how are we going to make our rec and parks, how are we going to make our parks more resilient? How are we going to make our business climate more resilient? How are we going to make our sensitive features more resilient? So each of those will touch upon resiliency in some fashion.
It's more departmental. Yeah, okay. All right.
Good? Okay, anything else for the? All right.
Let me just add one quick
Yes.
thing. As you know, we're still working with BG&E and adding electric vehicle charging stations throughout the city. So tomorrow I'm meeting with BG&E over at the Westin, the Park Place Garage. Weston's very interested in EV chargers there, and that's a facility that from which the city derives revenue. So these have to be city-owned, operated, or leased properties, even co-leased properties, co-owned properties, anything like that. And we're looking at a potential site on Annapolis Street in West Annapolis, and Gott's Garage. We're not looking at Hillman right now because that's all tied to city dock, rebricking, et cetera. And BG&E, for the work that they have to put in and the expense, it doesn't make a lot of sense for them to do something that might be relocated very soon. Interestingly, I'm already working with Tom Smith on perhaps getting some chargers over in the Eastport Shopping Center if and when that development happens. I know the developer is interested in a multimodal kind of transportation center for the condos and the retail, but this would be, we'd have to work out something where the city would either have a nominal purchase or nominal leaseback of spaces where we could put charging stations in.
So could we have one have you looked at or talked to Rick Gordon perhaps on Marketplace or down?
Yes, so I'm working with Rick.
You're working with Rick?
Yes, I am. And Marketplace, so we made a presentation to the Historic Preservation Commission, back in the summer, was in August. And they like the idea of chargers and want to learn more about how they would fit in and not become visual clutter. Yeah. But they didn't like them at Marketplace. They encouraged us to look at City Dock and other areas where the reimagining would not be taking place. Maybe perhaps in the, what's it called, Mission Barbecue area going towards Maryland Avenue and that area. And then asked us to look at Donner Lot. So those are two locations I will be exploring with BG&E in addition to Gott's, Annapolis Street, and the Park Place Garage, the Weston Garage over there. Now, still, open to other areas within the city. So, particularly in your wards, you may want to think about where we might put chargers. But again, they have to be on property that's owned, operated, or leased by the city.
Gott's is kind of cool because it's sort of a gateway for parking, people coming in. It's the first garage they hit. I don't know.
Which garage?
Gots?
Gots, yes,
Yeah.
we're looking at Gots.
Okay.
But not Knighton right now because there are free chargers there already.
Yeah.
And the juxtaposition of putting free chargers next to chargers for which you have to pay
Yeah,
is a little bit tricky. You know, maybe down the road we'll come up with something else.
The only place I can think of in Ward 7 would be the Ellen Moyer Park.
Yes, and we looked at that, but the initial thinking was that it's not used that often.
Yeah.
And BG&E prefers to put the chargers in locations where they also will be used by the residents of nearby communities in off hours. And that doesn't look like it would be used a lot there. There's not a lot of cars in that parking lot except when they have events.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else from the committee? Okay.
No.
Motion to adjourn, anybody?
I motion that we adjourn.
All right. Second? No. I'll second that. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
I'm still recovering from Monday night,
Everybody.
I think.